Let me tell you something. There's a moment, and most people who lived through it remember exactly where they were when the whole planet just stopped. Not metaphorically, not like, oh, the world stood still. I mean actual stillness. No cars honking, no arguments in kitchens, no background noise from televisions or radios or open windows. Every single human being on Earth, all 9 billion of us, went completely quiet at the exact same second. I was 23 years old. I was sitting at a food cart near the edge of the Nairobi Collaborative Zone, eating a bowl of ugali and stewed vegetables that I'd bought with the last of my weekly credits, watching the diplomatic feed on a small cracked tablet I'd borrowed from my supervisor at the Transit Authority. It was late afternoon. The equatorial sun was doing that thing it does just before it drops, painting everything orange and heavy, like the air itself is tired. And then the Verk ambassador opened his mouth. And every human being on Earth heard what he said. That was the beginning of everything that came after. Set up. You have to understand what the world looked like in 2091 to understand why that moment hit the way it did. We weren't the same species that had stumbled into the contact era. 40 years of first contact negotiations, technology exchanges, treaty frameworks, and interstellar diplomatic protocol had changed us. Not in our DNA, we were still the same argumentative, emotional, stubborn creatures we'd always been. But the surface had changed. The infrastructure had changed. The way we talked about ourselves had changed. When the Verk Collective first made contact in 2051, humanity had responded the way humanity always responds to something terrifying, with a mixture of panic, negotiation, and incredible ingenuity. The United Earth Governance Assembly, which had been a mostly ceremonial body before contact, suddenly had real power, real budget, real military authority. The orbital defense grid went up in 6 years. The deep space monitoring arrays followed. Trade protocols were established. Cultural exchange missions were organized, then quietly discontinued when it became clear that Verk aesthetics could trigger severe psychological distress in human subjects. We adapted, we learned. The Verk Collective was not the only species in what they called the Galactic Compact, but they were the dominant voice. They controlled about 60% of the trade routes in our region of the Spiral Arm. They had been spacefaring for 11,000 years. Their technology was so far ahead of ours that our top physicists had spent 3 decades just trying to understand the underlying principles behind their propulsion systems, not replicate them, just understand them conceptually. They knew this, and they made sure we knew that they knew this. But there were rules, there were agreements. The Galactic Compact had something called the Foundational Protocols, a set of behavioral standards that governed how established member species were supposed to treat provisional members. Earth had been a provisional member since 2059. We had observer status in the Compact Assembly. We had trade rights, though they were heavily restricted. We had the right to petition for dispute resolution. We did not have the right to vote on compact decisions. We did not have full sovereignty guarantees. We were, in the polite language of the protocols, a species under developmental observation. We had accepted this because we had to. The Verk didn't let us forget it, but they accepted the protocols too, at least publicly. There were things they couldn't say to our faces. There were diplomatic courtesies they were obligated to maintain. There were boundaries around what they could transmit on official channels. The Joint Broadcast Initiative was one of the newest agreements. Signed just 14 months before everything fell apart, the JBI was supposed to be a gesture of goodwill, a shared communication channel between Earth and the Compact that would allow for transparent, real-time diplomatic exchange. Humanity had pushed hard for it. We wanted visibility. We wanted to see the conversations that were happening about us, not just receive curated summaries filtered through Verk diplomatic translators. We got what we asked for. I remember my supervisor, a heavy-set man named Odhiambo who had been with the Transit Authority for 20 years and had the kind of quiet dignity that comes from watching the world change around you and choosing not to panic, said something interesting when the JBI was announced. He said, when someone agrees to let you listen in on their private conversations, it's not because they've decided to trust you. It's because they've decided they don't care what you hear. I didn't fully understand what he meant at the time. I do now. The Nairobi Collaborative Zone stretched across what used to be several different administrative districts, unified after the 2061 Reconstruction Accords. It was a working city, not a showpiece, not one of the gleaming joint development showcase zones like New Geneva or the Tianjin Compact Hub. It was full of ordinary people doing ordinary things. Mechanics who had learned to service hybrid human-Werk atmospheric processors, food vendors who had incorporated nutrition supplements from the trade exchanges into traditional recipes, transit workers like me who spent our days managing the flow of people and goods through a city that was always in motion. The diplomatic feeds were everywhere. Screens embedded in transit shelters, in market stalls, in the sides of buildings. The JBI had its own dedicated channel, a soft blue border around the frame, the Earth Compact Treaty emblem in the corner, simultaneous translation running in 47 languages. The big session that day was supposed to be a routine quarterly review. The Werk Compact Coordinator, a being named Velsarath Khan, was going to present Earth's Provisional Status Assessment, essentially a report card on how humanity was progressing toward full compact membership. These sessions happened 4 times a year. They were usually bureaucratic and boring. The Earth delegation would listen, the Werk would read prepared statements, and everyone would agree to continue the existing arrangements until the next meeting. Earth's senior diplomatic representative was Minister Anara Chen, a woman who had spent 30 years in interstellar diplomacy and who was famous for the kind of calm that looks like ice until you realize it's actually stone. She'd negotiated the Water Rights Compact of 2078. She'd handled the Titan mining dispute. She was not someone who rattled easily. I watched the feed begin. Odhiambo was somewhere behind me. I could hear him talking to a delivery driver about a delayed shipment. The sun was still doing its orange thing. A child somewhere nearby was arguing with her mother about something. Normal sounds. Normal afternoon. The Compact Coordinator began his prepared statement. And then about 12 minutes in, Compact Coordinator Velsarath Khan paused. He looked at something off-screen. There was a brief exchange in Werk fast, too fast for the simultaneous translator, which stuttered and produced a partial rendering. Then the coordinator turned back to the camera, and he was wearing an expression that the translator's cultural annotation system flagged as amusement bordering on contempt, and he said something that was not in his prepared statement. He said, "We have received an inquiry from the provisional delegation asking whether Earth's trade access rights might be expanded to include Class 7 mineral routes. We feel this is an appropriate moment to address what the collective privately refers to as the persistent overreach pattern of human diplomacy." Minister Chen went very still on her side of the feed. The coordinator continued. Humans are a curious case study in what the Compact's developmental science community calls terminal optimism disorder. They consistently overestimate their position, underestimate the patience of their hosts, and demonstrate a near-total inability to recognize the gap between where they are and where they imagine themselves to be. This is not said with malice. It is said with the same clinical observation one might apply to any primitive organism that does not yet understand the ecosystem in which it finds itself. My bowl was in my lap. I remember the warmth of it. I remember not feeling it anymore. The coordinator was still talking. The Class 7 access request will of course be denied, as will the 17 similar requests submitted in the past 4 years. We wish to be transparent, and the Joint Broadcast Initiative does require transparency, that the collective's internal assessment of Earth's readiness for expanded trade access remains, in colloquial terms, not in this millennium. The planet's resources are interesting. Its people are energetic. But the notion that humanity belongs at the same table as species who have navigated the stars for thousands of years is. He paused again. The cultural annotation system flagged what followed as a term used to describe things that are comically misaligned with reality, specifically small things that mistake themselves for large ones. He said, endearing. The silence that followed was not a diplomatic silence. It was 9 billion people holding their breath. I stared at my tablet. The feed was still running, the soft blue border, the treaty emblem, the simultaneous translation still scrolling. Minister Anara Chen had not moved, had not blinked, as far as I could tell. She sat with her hands folded on the table in front of her, and she looked at the compact coordinator with an expression I could not read, and she said nothing for exactly 11 seconds. 11 seconds is a long time in a live broadcast. Then she said, very quietly, the Earth delegation notes the coordinator's remarks and requests a 30-minute recess. The feed cut to the treaty emblem screen. And every human on Earth who had been watching started talking at the same time. I called Adhiambo over. He'd seen it on his own screen behind the dispatch counter. He came and stood next to me, and we watched the recess screen together without saying anything for a while. Finally he said, well, that happened. I said, what does it mean? He rubbed the side of his face slowly. I think it means that they don't think we're going to do anything about it. I asked him why. He said, because if they thought we were going to do something about it, they wouldn't have said it on the joint channel. That stuck with me. I turned it over in my head while the recess screen continued to display, and the noise of the city around us rebuilt itself. People coming to look at screens, people calling each other, voices rising and mixing into something that wasn't quite panic and wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite anything that had a familiar name. What Adhiambo was describing was a calculation. The Verk hadn't made an error. They hadn't been caught saying something private. They had looked at 9 billion humans, looked at all our treaties and all our agreements and all our carefully constructed diplomatic apparatus, and decided that we weren't going to do anything about being insulted. They had decided we would absorb it, that we would calculate our dependency on the trade routes and the technology transfers and the provisional membership protections, and we would decide that swallowing the insult was cheaper than the alternative. They had, in other words, decided exactly what we were worth. I want to tell you what the next 3 hours looked like, because I think most historical accounts focus on the decisions and the announcements and miss what it actually felt like on the ground. The feeds were everywhere. Every screen in the city was carrying reaction coverage, or the resumed broadcast, because the session did resume, and Minister Chen went back to that table and continued the meeting like a person made of absolute granite. She presented Earth's positions. She responded to compact questions. She did not raise her voice. She did not reference the coordinator's remarks. She was the most impressive human being I have ever watched do anything. But behind her, in the streets of every city on Earth, something was happening. It wasn't a riot, not yet. It wasn't organized enough for that. It was more like a sound, a low-frequency thing that you feel in your chest before you hear it with your ears. People gathering, people standing in groups in front of screens, people calling their families, people talking in the particular way that humans talk when they have been insulted collectively and don't know yet what to do with it. I watched a woman across the street, maybe 40 years old, working clothes, looked like she'd come off a shift somewhere, stand in front of a public screen with her arms crossed, and watch the feed replay the clip of the coordinator's remarks. She watched it once. She watched it twice. And then she turned away and I could see her jaw set and I could see something shift in her face. And I thought, that's what this is. That's what's happening in 9 billion faces right now. Not panic, not even anger yet. Just decision. The Werk diplomatic mission in New Geneva later released a statement calling the coordinator's remarks informal and contextually misunderstood, which was probably the most effective way possible to make things worse. The Earth Governance Assembly went into emergency session. I know that because the transit feeds in the collaborative zone switched over to carry it live, and I watched parts of it on the screens at the dispatch center, while Adhiambo pretended to do paperwork and actually watched every second. The assembly hall in Zurich was full. Not just the seated delegates, the observer galleries were packed. There were people standing in the corridors. The security directorate had tripled the presence around the building. The assembly chair, a quiet man from Oslo named Henrik Strand, who was known mainly for being procedurally precise and personally invisible, opened the session with a sentence that I have thought about many times since. He said, "We are not here to decide whether to be angry. We are here to decide what to do with the anger." And that was the last boring thing anyone said for the rest of the night. Part 2 of 3, the HOURS that followed. Word target, 8,500 words. I didn't go home that night. A lot of people didn't. The Transit Authority extended shifts automatically, not an official directive, just a quiet consensus that the city needed to keep moving, and the people who kept it moving needed to be there. Adhiambo made a call, got someone to bring food, and we all just stayed. The dispatch center became something between a workplace and a watch party, and something that didn't have a name yet. The assembly feed was on one screen. The JBI channel was on another. A third screen carried aggregated social response, not the hot takes and the screaming, but the measured kind of pulse reading that the UEGA's communication office had developed for crisis monitoring. Colors and numbers mostly, red sectors spreading. I kept watching the JBI channel because I wanted to see if the Werk were watching the reaction. I wasn't sure how their monitoring worked, but I'd read somewhere that the compact had passive observation access to public Earth networks as part of the JBI agreement. So theoretically, they could see every screen I could see. Theoretically, they could watch the woman across the street with her jaw set, watching the clip on loop. I wondered if it looked different to them than it did to me. I wondered if they understood what they were watching. The thing about the Galactic Compact's developmental model, the framework they used to classify and manage what they called emergent species, was that it was built on precedent from about 200 other civilizations that had gone through the contact process before us. The Werk had seen this a lot. They'd seen primitive species panic. They'd seen them overreach diplomatically. They'd seen them go quiet for decades and then try something clever that didn't work. They'd seen them fracture internally under the pressure of contact and collapse back into pre-spacefaring conflicts. What they had not seen, according to what I pieced together later, was a species that responded to humiliation the way humans do. Because here is the thing about us that took the Werk 11,000 years of interstellar experience to fail to anticipate. We don't calm down after we've been insulted. We get organized. The first concrete thing that happened in the assembly was the formation of the Emergency Review Committee, which sounds bureaucratic, but was actually the fastest any UEGA body had ever been assembled. It had 7 members. 3 were from the Security Directorate. 2 were from the Diplomatic Corps. 1 was a technology specialist from the Orbital Infrastructure Authority. And 1, this was the unusual one, was a retired military commander named General Ussult Brander, who had spent her career in the Planetary Defense Force before the contact era had made planetary defense a mostly theoretical concern. She was 71 years old. She had gray hair cut close to her skull, and the posture of someone who had spent decades in environments where posture meant survival. When she spoke in the assembly chamber that night, The room went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet around people who have earned a particular kind of gravity. She said, "I want to be clear about what we're actually discussing, not diplomatically, plainly." The Verk Collective used a jointly agreed communication channel to tell 9 billion humans, in front of 9 billion humans, that we are a primitive species too limited to understand our own position. They did this not by accident. They did this because they believe there are no consequences. My recommendation is that we spend the next 6 hours figuring out how to make them wrong about that. She sat down. The assembly erupted. I watched it in pieces, between transit calls and logistics issues that kept needing attention regardless of what was happening in Zurich. That was the strange thing about those hours. The mundane machinery of the world kept running. Shipments still needed routing. People still needed to get places. The food vendor, outside the transit authority, still needed to know if the morning supply run was on schedule. Life is very insistent about continuing. But between the calls I watched, what emerged from the chaos of the assembly debate was something that surprised me. I think most people had expected, a political fracture. The old patterns reasserting themselves. Factions arguing about the right response. The cautious voices calling for measured diplomatic action, and the angry voices calling for something bigger, and the two camps talking past each other while the window for any meaningful response closed. That didn't happen. What happened instead was something I don't have a clean word for, a kind of convergence. Delegates who had never agreed on anything agreeing. Factions that had spent decades in ideological opposition, finding common ground, so fast it was almost eerie. I think what happened was this. The coordinator's insult had been so total, so complete, so cheerfully certain, that it had done something unusual. It had given every human being on Earth the same experience at the same time. Not the same interpretation, not the same immediate reaction, but the same experience. The same moment of sitting in front of a screen and hearing 9 billion of us described as endearing little creatures who didn't understand the size of the world they were in. And that shared experience, that single synchronized wound, had temporarily dissolved the usual divisions. Not permanently. Nothing about humans is permanent when it comes to unity. But long enough. Long enough for what happened next. Assembly Chair Henrik Strand read the preliminary decision at 2:47 in the morning, Zurich time. I know it was 2:47 because I had been awake for 19 hours at that point and was watching the clock along with the feed, calculating how much longer I could stay functional. Strand read it the way he read everything, precisely, without theater, in a voice that could have been announcing a schedule change. He said, "The United Earth Governance Assembly, in emergency session, has voted to initiate the developmental withdrawal protocol." That was a phrase that didn't mean anything to most people until the next sentence. Earth hereby serves formal notice to the Galactic Compact that all 47 existing bilateral agreements between Earth and the Compact are suspended pending review. All Compact personnel currently on Earth soil are requested to begin withdrawal procedures within 72 hours. All Earthside operations supporting Compact infrastructure, including the orbital relay stations, the Deep Space Communications Array, and the Atmospheric Processing Partnership facilities, will cease operations in 36 hours pending a full review of their legal status under the suspended treaties. He looked up from the document. Earth will continue to honor its obligations under the foundational protocols as they apply to non-Verk Compact members. We remain open to communication through neutral intermediaries. We will not, at this time, be receiving Verk diplomatic communications on the Joint Broadcast Initiative channel. Pause. That concludes the formal notice. This session is in recess. Adhiambo and I looked at each other. The screen was showing the assembly chamber which had erupted again, but differently this time. Not argument, not debate, something louder and more unified and harder to describe. I said, did they just? Adhiambo said, yeah. All 47 agreements. Every one. I tried to process the scale of it, the trade access, the technology transfers, the provisional membership protections, the joint infrastructure projects, the communications frameworks, all of it suspended, simultaneously. By vote. Are we going to be okay? I asked. I know it sounds like a naive question, but it was 2:47 in the morning and I was 23 years old and I had grown up in a world where the compact's infrastructure was woven into everything, and the idea of pulling on all those threads at once was terrifying. Adhiambo was quiet for a moment. Then he said, humanity survived 40,000 years before the Verk showed up. We'll survive this. He paused. But it's going to be a rough few years. The Verk response came in 4 hours. Not through the JBI channel. Earth had already locked that down. It came through the neutral intermediary channel maintained by the Leth Communion, one of the other compact members who had always maintained more cordial relations with Earth. The message was 3 sentences. It said, the Verk Collective acknowledges receipt of Earth's notice. We wish to clarify that the coordinator's remarks were not intended as official collective policy statements and are being reviewed internally. We look forward to the continuation of the productive relationship between Earth and the Compact. 3 sentences. For 47 suspended agreements. The diplomatic corps released a formal response through the same intermediary. A single line that said the UEGA had noted the Verk communication and would respond when it had determined the appropriate format for future discussions. Then Earth went quiet. That quiet was not what the Verk expected. I have read enough of the subsequent analysis, the Compact's own internal communications that were later made available through the disclosure protocols, to know that the Verk Collective's first assessment of Earth's action was that it was a negotiating maneuver, a temporary withdrawal designed to extract concessions, a bluff. This made sense from their perspective. Every previous species they dealt with that had made similar gestures had folded within days. The mathematics were too overwhelming. Dependency was dependency. You could be angry about your position, or you could be comfortable in it, but you couldn't eat anger. The Verk were very good at mathematics. What they were not good at, what nothing in 11,000 years of interstellar diplomacy had prepared them for, was a species that was willing to eat the anger. The next 72 hours were the hardest hours Earth had experienced since the early contact era. The supply disruptions hit first. The atmospheric processing facilities that had been running on compact-derived systems went into reduced efficiency modes. In some regions, particularly the high-altitude zones that had become dependent on the hybrid processors, air quality indices dropped noticeably. Not dangerously, but enough to feel. Enough to be a constant, physical reminder of what had been given up. The orbital relay disruptions hit next. Communications that had been routed through compact infrastructure, faster-than-light data transmission, long-range navigation support for Earth's small but growing merchant fleet, suddenly had to reroute through older, slower Earth-built systems. It wasn't catastrophic, but it was uncomfortable. Lag where there had been immediacy. Gaps where there had been coverage. The economic impacts were harder to see in real time, but hit faster than the models had predicted. Trade partners who had been using compact-backed credit systems started pulling back. Several developing member states of the UEGA that had been most dependent on compact trade access began to experience supply shortages. The UEGA's emergency reserve protocols activated. There were lines at distribution centers in some cities. I saw one of those lines. Outside the Nairobi zone's eastern distribution point, stretching back 2 city blocks, people waiting patiently, bringing their own containers, moving forward slowly in the early morning heat. What struck me was not the line itself. What struck me was how quiet it was. Disciplined. Like everyone understood without being told that this was a moment that required a certain kind of behavior. Minister Anara Chen appeared on the public broadcast channel 48 hours after the Assembly's vote. She didn't speak from a podium. She wasn't in an official room with flags and emblems behind her. She was sitting at a table, like a person, with a glass of water, and she looked tired in the way that people look when they have been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and have decided not to pretend otherwise. She said, "I want to speak to everyone clearly without diplomatic language. What you heard 2 days ago was designed to make you feel small. It was designed to remind you of a gap between what we are and what they are, and to suggest that the gap was too large for us to ever bridge. I was at that table. I heard every word. I want you to know that what I felt was not despair. What I felt was something much older and much simpler than despair." She picked up the glass of water, took a sip, set it down. Humans have been told we're too small for things our whole history. Every time, we eventually stop being told that. Not because we argued our way into being taken seriously, not because we pleaded, but because we did the work and the work spoke for itself. She looked directly at the camera. "This is going to be hard. I'm not going to pretend it isn't. There will be shortages. There will be disruptions. Some of what we built alongside them will have to be rebuilt without them, and that will take time and effort and a lot of problem solving. I know that. The Assembly knows that. And we decided to do it anyway because what the alternative would have required of us was something I am not willing to ask you to give." She paused. "We are not endearing. We are not primitive organisms who don't understand the ecosystem. We are 9 billion problem-solving, adapting, stubborn, creative, occasionally infuriating human beings. And if the Galactic Compact wants to understand us, they are going to have to do it on our terms, not theirs." She stood up. "Thank you, stay steady." She walked out of frame. I showed that broadcast to Adhiambo when I got back to the dispatch center. He watched it all the way through without moving. When it was done, he said, "She was at that table." I said, "Yeah." He said, "And she came back the next day and kept talking to them." I said, "Yeah." He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "You know what the hardest kind of courage is? It's not the kind where you do the brave thing in the moment. That's adrenaline, mostly. The hardest kind is where you sit back down at the table and keep doing the work even when every part of you wants to flip the table over." He looked at the blank screen. "She flipped it eventually." I said, "Yeah, just not in the room." The Werk Collective made 3 separate communication attempts in the first 72 hours after the suspension notice. Each one came through the Leth Communion intermediary. Each one used more conciliatory language than the one before it. The third one included a formal expression of regret over the interpretive difficulties caused by the coordinator's remarks. The UAGA responded to each one with the same message. Earth was engaged in an internal review process and would communicate through appropriate channels when the review was complete. The Werk were not used to waiting. I know from the later disclosure documents that there were serious internal debates within the collective about whether Earth was actually going to follow through, or whether this was an elaborate negotiating position that would collapse under economic pressure. The dominant faction in those early days apparently believed, right up until the 36th hour, when the atmospheric processing partnership facilities went dark as announced, that humanity would blink. They didn't blink. This is the part that I think about most when I think about those days. Not the decisions, not the announcements, not the politics. What I think about is the people in the distribution line. The quiet one, stretching back 2 blocks in the eastern heat. Because that line represented something. It represented people making a collective choice, not through a vote, not through a declaration, but through the simple act of standing in line and waiting patiently and not losing their composure, to bear the consequence of a decision that the assembly had made on their behalf. The assembly had voted, but the people in that line had to live the vote. And they did it, not because they were told to, not because there was some enforcement mechanism making them behave. They did it because they understood, in the wordless way that people understand big things, that this was a moment that required a certain version of themselves. That's the thing the Werk didn't understand. They had modeled Earth's economic dependency. They had modeled our political fractures. They had modeled our historical response patterns. They had not modeled what 9 billion people can do when they feel, all at the same time, that their dignity has been questioned. Dignity is not in any economic model. It doesn't show up in dependency metrics. You can't put it in a treaty clause or a developmental assessment protocol. But it is, as it turns out, extremely load-bearing. Part 3 of 3, What Came After? Word target, 9,000 words. Here is something that doesn't show up in the history feeds. On the 4th day after the agreements were suspended, a team of engineers from the UEGA's Infrastructure Reconstruction Division published a paper. It had been in peer review for 8 months, standard process. It was a dense, technical document about a new approach to atmospheric processing that used Earth-derived materials and Earth-developed systems. The approach was less efficient than the compact hybrid systems, by about 18%. But it worked, and it didn't require any compact components. The paper had been in a queue, waiting its turn, completely unremarkable until the morning of the 4th day when someone, nobody knows who, posted it to the general public science feeds with a note attached that just said, "This might be useful right now." Within 24 hours, 3 different UEGA engineering consortiums had contacted the authors about accelerated implementation. Within a week, the Nairobi zone's atmospheric facilities had begun the conversion process. The 18% efficiency gap got fixed, by the way. It took 4 years, but it got fixed. That was the pattern of those months, humans solving problems because they had to. Not because the solutions were elegant, not because they had the luxury of waiting for the best option, but because necessity is a very effective teacher. The faster-than-light communications dependency was harder to crack. We didn't have the physics for it, not then. What we developed instead was a network of relay stations that used our own slower systems but were positioned more intelligently, reducing lag by about 60% compared to the pre-suspension baselines. Not as fast as compact routing, but hours, built in 8 months by people who hadn't slept properly in 8 months. I watched that network go live from the dispatch center. Adiambo and I had a small celebration with terrible instant coffee that someone had found in a supply closet. It was the best coffee I've ever had. The Werk made a formal diplomatic request for a resumption of talks in the 3rd month. This time they sent it directly to the UEGA diplomatic corps, not through an intermediary. That itself was a shift, a small one, but visible to anyone who understood the protocol. Using the direct channel meant acknowledging that Earth was a party to be communicated with, not a developmental subject to be managed. The request used language that was notably different from anything that had come before. It described Earth as a sovereign partner in regional galactic development, and expressed the collective's high regard for the resilience and capability demonstrated by Earth's governance systems during the current period of realignment. The UEGA's diplomatic corps met for 2 days before responding. Their response said, Earth acknowledges the collective's request and is prepared to engage in preliminary discussions. Earth's preliminary position for any resumed negotiations is as follows: full member status in the Galactic Compact, not provisional, equal vote in Compact Assembly proceedings, removal of developmental observation status, unrestricted access to Class 7 through Class 12 trade routes. a formal public statement from the Werk Collective regarding the remarks made on the Joint Broadcast Initiative. There were 7 more bullet points. The compact's response to those preliminary conditions took 11 days. That was, according to every Werk precedent on record, an extraordinarily fast response. Minister Chen was in those negotiations. I know because she gave another broadcast address when they concluded, about a year and a half later, and she talked about what it had been like to sit in those rooms. She said the thing that struck her most was a change in how the Werk negotiators looked at the human delegation. She said that in the pre-suspension era, there was always something in how they held themselves, a particular quality of attention, or maybe inattention, that communicated a settled assumption. She said it was like negotiating with someone who was very politely pretending to listen while they waited for you to agree to what they'd already decided. After the suspension, she said, that quality was gone. She said it didn't make them easier to negotiate with. In some ways, it made them harder. They were more careful, more precise, more guarded. But the difference was that they were actually listening. She said they were trying to figure us out. They genuinely didn't understand what had happened. 11,000 years of spacefaring, 200 contact processes, and they'd never encountered a species that responded to an insult by going completely silent, doing enormous amounts of work in the dark, and coming back to the table stronger than before. She smiled a little. We're a strange species. I have thought a lot about why the Werk were so surprised. Partly it was the math. The dependency was real. The economic pain was real. By any model they'd built from previous contact experiences, the cost of the withdrawal should have been prohibitive. The political will to sustain it should have fragmented within weeks. Regional and factional divisions within humanity, which were real and significant, should have created enough internal pressure to force a resumption of the agreements on the collective's terms. That was what had happened with the 6 species before us who had tried similar measures. The Werk had documented case studies. But there was something else, something the documentation didn't capture because it couldn't be measured in the variables the compact's models tracked. The insult had been public. Every human being, in real time together. That simultaneity mattered in a way that private or reported insults wouldn't have. It created a collective memory that was shared in the same moment, not reconstructed afterward. And that shared moment built something that the economic and political models couldn't account for, a kind of agreement between 9 billion people that wasn't written down and couldn't be negotiated around. The Werk had used the Joint Broadcast Initiative, our own initiative, the one we'd pushed for, to deliver the insult. We had wanted to be seen. They had decided to let us see the truth of what they thought. And the truth, it turned out, was more useful to us than the comfortable version had been. The formal renegotiation of the Earth Compact relationship took 2 years and 4 months. I was 25 when Minister Chen read the final agreement text in the Assembly Hall. I watched it on a screen that was bigger and better than the cracked tablet I'd been using 3 years earlier, in a transit authority dispatch center that had been expanded and upgraded with systems that had been designed and built on Earth by people who had been working extremely hard for 2.5 years. Adhiambo stood next to me. The agreement gave Earth full member status. The developmental observation designation was formally retired. Earth received unrestricted access to 11 of the 12 requested trade route classes. The assembly voting rights were confirmed. The Werk Collective delivered a formal statement about the JBI broadcast that used the specific phrasing that Earth's diplomatic corps had required, not diplomatic language, not interpretive difficulties. Specific acknowledgement that the coordinator's remarks had been inappropriate and had not reflected the collective's official position. It wasn't the last item on the agenda, it was item 3. the Werk had agreed to do it first, before anything else was signed. When the assembly chair confirmed the final agreement and the chamber erupted, Odhiambo did something I had never seen him do in the 2 years I'd worked with him. He cried. Not dramatically, just a quiet thing. He turned slightly away and pressed the heel of his hand against one eye, and when he turned back he was himself again, but I'd seen it. I pretended I hadn't. You do that for people sometimes. After a moment he said, in his usual voice, 18% efficiency gap. I said, what? He said, that's what the atmospheric systems were when we first switched over, 18% less efficient than the compact systems. You remember? I said I remembered. He said, what's the current gap? I thought about it, 3%, maybe 2.5%. He nodded slowly. 4 years, he said. 4 years and we closed most of it on our own. I said, yeah. He was quiet for a little while, watching the screen where the assembly was still celebrating. Then he said, you know what I think the Werk miscalculated. I don't think they understood that an 18% gap for us is not a humiliation. It's a starting point. There are things I want to say about what came after that are harder to articulate. Because the story doesn't end cleanly. It doesn't have the kind of resolution where the problem is solved and everyone is better and the lesson is learned. That's not how things work, not in diplomacy and not in human experience. The Werk-Earth relationship remained complicated. Full membership in the compact opened doors, but it also created new tensions, new resentments on the collective side, new expectations that Earth didn't always meet, new disputes about trade and territory and cultural exchange that kept the diplomatic corps in business for decades. There were humans who thought the UEGA had been too aggressive, who thought the suspension had been unnecessary, that a quieter, more patient approach would have achieved better results with less pain. The people who had stood in the distribution lines, some of them held those 2 years of supply disruptions against the assembly long after the agreements were signed. There were humans who thought the new agreement hadn't gone far enough, who felt that full member status was still less than what Earth deserved, who carried a version of the wound that the JBI broadcast had opened in a form that negotiations hadn't completely closed. Both of those groups were right about something. The people who had suffered the consequences of the withdrawal, the ones who had lived through the supply shortages and the communication disruptions and the economic strain, were right that cost is not abstract. That decisions have weight, and the weight lands on real people, and real people deserve to have their experience acknowledged. And the people who felt that the achievement was incomplete were right that it was. Earth's position in the compact in the years following the agreement was still more constrained than we wanted it to be. The power dynamics had shifted significantly, but they hadn't inverted. The Werk were still, in most ways, the dominant voice in compact affairs. We'd changed our relationship with them. We hadn't changed the structure of the universe. Both of those things were true. What was also true was that 3 years before, the compact coordinator had described us as endearing little creatures too limited to understand the ecosystem we were in. And 18 months later, the Werk Collective had been sitting across a negotiating table trying to figure out how to keep us in an ecosystem that we had just demonstrated we could survive without them. I think about the woman across the street sometimes, the one who watched the clip on the public screen twice and then turned away with her jaw set. I don't know who she was. I never spoke to her. I have no idea what she did during those 2 years, what her specific experience of the disruptions was, whether she supported the Assembly's decision or resented it. But I remember what I saw in her face. Not anger exactly, something calmer and more durable than anger, a decision that had been made quietly, without theater, in the few seconds it took to watch a clip twice and turn away. That face, that expression, that particular kind of human response to being underestimated. I think about it when people ask me what I remember about those years. They always expect me to talk about Minister Chen or the assembly vote or the diplomatic achievements, and those things matter. Those things are the official story, and the official story is real and important. But the unofficial story, the thing that made all of it possible, was 9 billion people in front of 9 billion different screens, all watching the same clip, all making the same quiet decision in the same quiet way. The Verkid tried to define us with a single word. Endearing. 9 billion people decided, more or less simultaneously and without coordination, that they disagreed. And then they went about proving it. General Ussult Brander was interviewed once, several years after the new agreement, by a journalist who asked her what the decision to recommend the suspension had felt like in the moment, whether there had been doubt. She said, of course there was doubt. The economic models were not encouraging. The dependency metrics were real. I'd spent my career thinking about planetary defense, and the honest truth is that the scariest scenarios I'd ever modeled were nothing compared to the prospect of cutting off from the compact's technology infrastructure while still being far from self-sufficient. The journalist asked what had overcome the doubt. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I kept thinking about what happens to a species that learns to accept being described the way the coordinator described us. Not in this instance, sure, you absorb it, the math is too hard otherwise. But what about the next one? And the one after that? At what point does the habit of absorbing the insult become the shape of who you are? She leaned forward slightly. I've studied a lot of military history, human military history, which is substantial. And the thing I've noticed is that the battles that define a people are rarely the ones they were most prepared for. They're usually the ones that came at an inconvenient time with the wrong resources against impossible odds. The Compact's developmental model said that Earth wasn't ready, that we were too dependent, too fractured, too limited. Maybe they were right about all of that. But we weren't fighting the battle we were ready for. We were fighting the battle that was in front of us. She settled back. Turns out we were readier than anyone thought, including us.